There was a time when people said this didn't feel like Star Wars. Or this. Or this. This was too much like Star Wars. This looked too much like Star Wars. Look, the point is, Star Wars is enigmatic. Lightning in a bottle, perfectly captured by George Lucas. A masterpiece whether he meant it or not. So when Disney bought Star Wars, it was always a risky decision. And while there have been countless videos about their failure, one thing no one has talked about is that Disney's Star Wars doesn't feel like Star Wars. Except for Andor. Andor and Rogue One. Now, there's a lot of ways to sum up the ethos of Star Wars, and there's a lot of people who would disagree with how I've done it, which ironically kind of proves my point, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Today, I want to talk about how Andor, and Rogue One before it, feels like Star Wars, and why if Disney had learned from this, we'd be in a different place entirely. When trying to wrap my head around the ethos of Star Wars, I've boiled it down to 3 simple components: innovation, mythology, and world building. And in this video, I want to look at how these 3 aspects run through the heart of Star Wars, and are the reason why Andor feels like Star Wars, despite it largely being unrecognizable. But it all started with Rogue One.
A major weapons test is imminent. We need to know what it is and how to destroy it.
One of the most unnecessary and unsuspecting projects coming out of Disney Star Wars, the director Gareth Evans had a vision.
No, honestly, what I feel all the time is it's George's film. Like basically everything in that movie that's any good, that people love, is probably somehow from George Lucas in some way.
Oh, well, that explains a lot. Beyond just respecting the lore, characters, and world building of Star Wars, Rogue One was the first project that actually seemed to embrace its original creator under the Disney banner. And with that, the approach that George took in all of his movies: innovation. The prequel trilogy is entirely different from the original series. Not just to be different, but to establish a clear distinction between the rule of the Republic and the era of the Empire. It adds on to the story of Star Wars in an original way, giving all the dramatic moments of the original trilogy more emotional context and severity. It doesn't undermine, and it doesn't subvert. And Rogue One managed to mimic this approach to storytelling perfectly. It's connecting the dots between films, adding context, adding drama, without at all subverting it. It feels like Star Wars we've seen before, yet in comparing it to previous Star Wars films, it's unlike any of them. It's a heist and a war movie all in one, feeling more like sci-fi Vietnam than a space opera. But it fits because it is the world that George Lucas created. It's a story about good versus evil. It's even a story with Darth Vader in it, but this time it's from the ground up. It's not from the perspective of the chosen one or the great heroes of the epic, but from the average soldier. And you know what? The average soldier dies. Andor continues this focus. The idea of a rebellion versus an endless imperial swarm is something that's definitely present in the original series. And so instead of recreating this theme, Andor takes it and delves deeper, just like Lucas did with the prequels. Or really, any of the projects he created. George Lucas never made a movie that was the same. And while there are similar concepts, characters, and ideas, each movie is entirely different at its core. There's a classic fairy tale, a family drama, a Greek tragedy, and even a neo-noir film. I've always fundamentally rejected the idea that Star Wars is just a sugar-coated fable about good versus evil. It's just a broader one. And Andor, leaning on the foundation of these ideas and concepts, just delves deeper. Because of this, it continues to innovate narratively the way that Lucas did. It tackles something from an angle that hasn't been shown before. It explores a subgenre that we haven't seen, all while enhancing the narratives that came before it. We know that the rebels fought the Empire. We know that the Empire is oppressive, and we know that war takes sacrifice and costs lives. But this time, we get to see it up close. And that makes all the difference.
I hear so many young people today talk about a world that's emptied of heroism, where there are no more noble things to do. What do you say to them?
Star Wars has always tackled myths. George Lucas famously pulled from the work of Joseph Campbell and the hero of A Thousand Faces.
But this one sort of lent itself to another idea I had, which was to take mythic motifs, psychological motifs from a few thousand years ago, and see if they still worked, see if people still cared about the same issues, about their parents, friendship, society, all these sorts of things.
So if the first 6 Star Wars movies are a space opera, a mythic tragedy for the modern time, then Andor is the real life that it's based off of. It retains the moral substance while complicating it. Andor combines the tragedy of the prequel trilogy and the hope of the original trilogy, and with Rogue One kind of bridging the gap between Andor, this becomes even more apparent.
You're asking us to invade an Imperial installation based on nothing but hope.
Rebellions are built on hope.
Andor builds on this concept of hope, but instead of having characters who believe in it, it has characters who wish to. A universe just beginning to take action with the hope of hope, but unsure if it will actually last. One of the things that Season 1 of Andor became known for was its monologues. 3 monologues, to be specific, in 3 kind of key moments throughout the season. But a concept, an idea that I think joins all 3 of these monologues together is the birth of hope.
There is one way out.
The Empire is a disease that thrives in darkness. It is never more alive than when we sleep.
I burn my decency for someone else's future. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see. Now, the ego that started this fight will never have a mirror or an audience or the light of gratitude. So what do I sacrifice? Everything!
In as many ways as it's a Star Wars story, it's also a story about Star Wars, about the cost of hope, the cost of rebellion. It follows a man not simply fighting for what he believes in, but learning the point of belief. It's a reminder of why Star Wars matters, and why it did in the first place. We remember things like lightsabers, TIE fighters, Jedi, and Sith. But I think the reason these elements are so memorable is not simply because of the wonder they invoke, but because of the underlying truth in the stories themselves.
When the movie came out, everybody said, oh, it's fantastic, it's all about special effects, that's why everybody wants to see it. I said, that has nothing to do with it.
Lightsabers are cool, but they represent something greater, the ideas of the Jedi, the stoicism and compassion of a true hero. And I think our connection to these objects and the realities they are tied to would not be as strong if it weren't for the characters, the themes, and really the kind of gritty, grounded nature of the objects themselves. Now, I know it seems absurd to say that something as fantastical as Star Wars was grounded, but it was. If you look at sci-fi films that came before, many of them had a polished, clean aesthetic. But Lucas, even before doing Star Wars, wanted to create sci-fi that felt lived in. He used real human objects, real locations, simply using kind of visual and practical effects for the final bit of creative trickery. And this same method is used on both Rogue One and Andor. Real sets, real actors, real, well, everything. For as much as the sequel trilogy, movies like The Force Awakens, talked about using practical effects, it actually had more CGI and VFX shots than The Phantom Menace. The reason why the world building of Rogue One and Andor worked, beyond revisiting what we remember from the original trilogy, is because they weren't slaves to world building. They used it, as Lucas did, to accent the story and characters as a part of the whole. And when they did do it, they leaned into the ideas he had already established. A dirty, gritty, lived-in world, and sometimes an artificial one. World building, music, props, set pieces, all that fit the story, not the other way around. It's difficult to describe a feeling, and I think often the role of art and storytelling is to bring these feelings and experiences into reality because we can't put them into words. So when people say that Disney Star Wars doesn't feel like Star Wars, it's hard to know what they really mean. And more importantly, when we say something does, it's even less clear. But if you look at Rogue One and Andor, stories that went beyond just lightsabers and spaceships, Skywalkers and Solos, they managed to capture the essence of what makes Star Wars great. The innovation, the mythology, and the world building. And while it might be too late, if there were creators at Disney that did adopt this approach, well, one can only hope. See, the grand irony of the situation with Disney is that to truly be like George Lucas, to embrace the spirit behind the original Star Wars trilogy, would be to move away from Star Wars as we know it, to create something new, even within the franchise. And while Disney may not listen, we can. But as always, these are just my thoughts and opinions. I mean, I would love to know what you guys think in the comments down below. If you want to see more videos like this, please, like, subscribe, check out the email list down below. And as always, keep reading, keep writing, and I will see you all in the next video.